Meeting of the Transportation Authority's Administration and Projects Committee meet to order, and welcome everyone here. Let the record show that everyone is in attendance because Commissioner Arnerich is walking in the door as we speak. Morning. I say, weren't you just here? So everyone is here. The first item on our agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to comment on items that are not on today's agenda. We will also take public comment on the agenda items as we go through them. Is there anyone who wishes to make a public comment? Seeing none, the next item is the approval of the minutes. Any comments?
Move approval.
Second.
A motion by Pierce, second by Arnerich. Any further comments? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. It's unanimous. Next item is the consent calendar. These are items that we will act on in one motion unless an item is removed by a member of staff, member of the public, or a commissioner. Commissioner Arnerich.
I just have a question on one, and this is on the change orders for substituting stamped paving in lieu of landscaping. The way it's written, it says the city chose not to landscape it, which sort of means they were paying for that. So if they were, then why aren't they going to pay for? Because we're just about out of contingency on that project. Hi, good morning, Susan.
Good morning. Since I'm kind of involved in the landscaping for Highway 4, I can respond to that. We are including that as a cost to the project. The city's criteria is for medians 6 feet and less. They would prefer that it be stamped concrete because of the maintenance aspect, but in those areas where the landscape, the medians are wider, they will be landscaping, and that's going to be a part of the SR4 landscaping job, which is a follow-on project.
So in either case, whether it be hardscape or soft, the project would be responsible to provide that. The maintenance, though, was...
The city will be maintaining those median landscapes. They'll be maintaining it after we're done.
Because the way it was written, it seemed like they were making a decision not to install it as though they were the ones that originally were going to. So with that, I don't have no other questions, so I'd move to accept.
Okay, there's a motion to accept the consent calendar, second by Commissioner Taylor. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you. That brings us to our regular agenda items, the first of which is discussion of the proposed 2016 Transportation Authority State and Federal Legislative Advocacy Program. Ms. Willis.
Good morning, Chair Tatson and Commissioners. And since our state advocate just walked in the door, I'll give him maybe a moment to get settled before I have him talk you through kind of our state platform and give you a brief update on what's been happening in Sacramento the first few days of the new session. But perhaps we could start with the federal platform. And traditionally, the authority has adopted both a state and a federal platform, and these platforms serve as guidelines for this body and the folks who act on our behalf in terms of legislation that we're following, items that we'd like to help push forward. And many of the items on both the state and the federal platform this year are very similar to last year's platform that was adopted by this body. And at least on the federal side, there is one item, actually the pre-tax transportation benefits, that we can already claim a win on, because in late December, after this packet was put together in the appropriations bill, Congress did restore permanent parity between the parking benefit and the transit benefit. So I would suggest to this body that we could potentially remove this before it goes back to the board for final approval, because it's something that's already been accomplished in a previous bill. But the federal platform focuses a bit on funding and finding a secure, stable source of funding, making sure that our local sales tax dollars are spent locally. We have been working with some of our delegations' offices on an issue with the FAA where they are attempting to potentially collect some local sales tax that relates to airports for their own purposes. So we're watching that very closely and working to try to make sure that nobody can reach in and take local dollars for a purpose other than local transportation. We're also focusing quite a bit on some of the new technologies. There's some opportunities in the new FAST Act, and we want to be sure that we take advantage of those. So that is kind of just a brief summary of what we're keeping our eye on at the federal level. And then at the state level, do you want to talk a little bit about the platform and kind of what's happening so far?
Before we do that one, welcome. Are there any questions about the federal? Yeah, I understand, thank you. Taking the item on pre-tax transportation benefits out. The other thing you might do is amend it and just take credit for it. Say we've already implemented part of what you had proposed.
Check.
Right. Randy, did you have a comment? Okay. All right. Well, we'll move them both. Okay. Now we'll move to the state. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I apologize for appearing a few minutes late. Cordelia proved to be a problem this morning, but everything's going smooth out there now, so hope it continues. The state platform has been updated. I think staff did a really good job of a first cut at weeding out things that had been in previous ones that didn't need to be continued here, and then adding in a couple of the new priorities that you have, including touching bases or providing for support for autonomous vehicle legislation, as well as updating the sales tax authority appropriately. So taking it from the top, basically, we've traditionally looked for protecting sources of transportation funding, and particularly the last several years looking for and supporting new sources of funding. You'll find that in this, and I'll have a real brief update when I get to the end of this on what's going on in Sacramento. Probably an area of interest that is only very recent has been the last couple of years focus on cap and trade funding and trying to maximize the amount, particularly of the fuels regime cap and trade auction revenues coming back to transportation. Just a brief note on that. Last summer when the legislature broke, they didn't complete their negotiations on the unallocated portion of cap and trade. There's about $1.7 billion left. And that's before the governor announces how much he expects for the 16-17 year. They had hopes in the fall of coming up with a package. There's still negotiations going on, and legislation has been introduced with blank spots for discussions to ensue in February. So cap and trade will be front and center, and I'll be coordinating with your staff as that moves forward. One area that we've had on the program is pursuing innovative project delivery. There have been some progress. I would note that the public-private partnership procurement process expires at the end of this year. There is a focus and looking for a way to get that extended. Design build has been taken care of to a degree. It has a few years to run on its sunset date, but the elusive element that is really, I think, the highlight of the program is trying to pursue CMGC as a procurement process for complicated projects that you will be looking at in the future. I have hopes that the Assembly Chairman will be pursuing that in the context of a transportation funding plan. So I think you have a realistic program here that has some needed work. The program doesn't need work, but it's providing a direction on work that needs to be done for the year that's appropriate for the agency. In terms of what's happening in Sacramento, as you know, the special session was convened. A couple of hearings were conducted. It continues as a special session until the end of November, or unless it's adjourned earlier. And there are discussions going on between the two co-chairs, Senator Bell on the one half and Assemblymember Jimmy Gomez on the other hand, about conducting some hearings in February. Senator Bell, in preparation for that, is updating his legislation. He had about a $4 billion package that he's revising and enhancing with additional revenues in it, and is expected to exceed $5.5 billion. Some of that will be cap and trade, and some of that will be possibly recapturing a portion of truck weight fees, but not all. Kind of in a nod to the governor that we want it all. We know you're not going to give it to us all, but here's an approach that may open the door to discussions. So he's very hopeful. He's had very good discussions with his leadership, and he has a scheduled presentation at his caucus next Tuesday to go through his updated bill, and we'll be able to walk through. And I think a very important element of what he's been able to do is bring along a key Republican as a potential co-author in that House. That's important, and we'll see if that is borne out when he releases his package next week. Assemblymember Frazier, who was not involved at all in the special session conference committee for a lot of reasons, has developed and yesterday released, you probably saw brief summaries of his package. It's about $7 billion ongoing. First year would be close to $8 billion because of bringing in one-time repayment of outstanding loans of almost $900 million, but then ongoing would be about $700 million. And it's essentially 22.5 cents a gallon gas tax, 30 cents a gallon diesel tax, registration fee of about $38, and then supplemented by some ongoing commitment from cap and trade for trade corridor improvement purposes. So it's a comprehensive package. I think it's important to look at those two packages and understand that when you look at those two and contrast them with the governor's package, which is about $3.5+ billion, that they have a lot of similarities. You can almost look at each of the tax sources, and on a continuum, they don't mirror each other, but they differentiate themselves by how much. For example, the gas tax, the governor's package restores 6 cents a gallon that goes to STIP and local governments. Mr. Frazier has a 22-cent, and we're not sure where Mr. Bell is going to show up. Same thing applies to diesel. There's a diesel tax in each of the three. It's just a varying amount. And I think, and that applies as well to the registration fee. Each of the three have different levels of registration fees. And I think if you kind of look at it as a dashboard of revenue, I think the negotiations are going to settle in on how far back and forth you slide either the gas tax, diesel tax, or registration fee to get to that magic sum. So, and just to wrap it up, the governor will be unveiling his 2016-17 budget proposal today at 10 a.m. And I'm told by the secretary that it will contain kind of a reiteration and maybe with some modest improvements of his of the governor's plan that was put into play last August. And again, that was about a $3.5 billion. I expect to see that go up, probably with some cap and trade revenue being dedicated to more capital for transit. So that's what's going on in Sacramento. It's going to be a busy month. Leadership changes kind of confuse things during the fall, but that's all settled out. And the two Republican leaders have assumed their new offices as of the beginning of this week, and then the changeover of the speaker from Speaker Atkins to Speaker-elect Rendon is scheduled for March 7th. So that completes my report.
Thank you. Are there questions? Commissioner Taylor and then Commissioner Arnerich.
With the price of oil plummeting, thus I would presume the price of gas should. How does that going to affect, i.e., the tax? Or but it be even on the federal level plus the state level?
Well, I think at the state level, if we were in an environment where the price of gas in California, the nation, frankly, was at the sustained high levels it had been 2 years ago, I think that would have a wet blanket effect on the discussions. I think the fact that it looks like for the foreseeable future, and this is based on data that I'm seeing from the Board of Equalization and the Department of Finance, they're projecting continued low prices. While we still may be higher than other states, they're still going to be suppressed compared to where they were 2 years ago, and I think that gives running room for negotiations to proceed. In other words, I think if it goes up, all bets are off. people will be frightened to vote for taxes.
Mark, thanks for your report. What do you think, or is there talk of what the governor's plans are as we see our sales tax that he lobbied for that's going to sunset here? And that's going to create, I don't know, what is it, $4 billion, $6 billion hole. Is this budget, do you anticipate it's going to begin to plan for that? Or is the assumption is somehow that's just going to get repassed?
I think you've got cross-cutting currents. You've got revenues under the current laws, including the sales tax. You're talking about the general fund education sales tax. Yeah. Projections from the legislative analysts show that by the end of 16-17, we may have a rainy day reserve as large as $7 billion. So I think he's going to hold fast on not supporting initially in the budget process. I'll probably turn out to be wrong in an hour and a half, but I would suspect that he will not put a proposal on the table to do anything with the extension of that. Watch how things go with the actual revenues from all the other sources coming in, and then see if there's a need to extend it. That's just his characteristic that I've watched him, in his first term and now in his earlier terms and now in his second suite of terms. So
the reason why I ask is that's really the key. All of the talk about additional funding for transportation, the first thing to go, right, is transportation funding. And I get it. I mean, that's just there are other priorities. So it's pretty important, how they end up dealing with that. And if he kicks the can down, we might get a one-year window, but ultimately there's a big hole. And having $7 billion rainy day fund, that's a one-year hole.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't really solve the problem. But great, thanks.
And then, thank you. I had a quick question, and this may have been resolved, and I just wasn't paying attention. I know that there was discussion about whether to assess fees for electric vehicles to try and make up for the fact that they don't pass or pay for gasoline tax. So whatever happened?
Well, it's embedded in two of these proposals I discussed, so nothing on its own has passed.
All right.
But, for example, Mr. Frazier has, I think it's a $165 EV fee. Mr. Bell had a $100 EV fee on top of the registration fee in his package. The governor notably has 0 EV fee in his package, so I think that's going to be a headwind for anybody who wants to enact that electric vehicle surcharge.
Great. Thank you. Are there other questions? All right. Is there a motion Commissioner Taylor's recommended that we forward the recommendations as modified to staff, but we have a comment first?
I actually just had one more bill I wanted to mention really
right.
quickly, and I can do that before or after your vote. So.
Well, why don't we then see if there's a second for the policies. There's a second by, take your choice. You can either have Commissioner Pierce or Commissioner Arnrich. They tied. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Now.
Okay. There was an additional bill introduced this morning that I wanted to bring to your attention. It's AB 1592 by Assemblywoman Bonilla. So if you've been following any of the autonomous vehicle regulations that were recently released by DMV, they have put out some rules that specify a car must have a driver, steering wheel, brake pedal in order to operate. And as Randy has mentioned, we have an exclusive agreement with Easy Mile, which is the manufacturer of those cute little transit 12-person shuttles. And we have been talking with a few local entities like Bishop Ranch about how we could potentially run a pilot demonstration. Those vehicles do not have a steering wheel or a brake pedal. So we have been working with Assemblywoman Bonilla's office to introduce some legislation that would allow us to run a pilot program to test those vehicles. So that was introduced this morning by the Assemblywoman, and we'll be coming back for an official vote of support from this body, but we are working very closely with our office. She did introduce it on our behalf, and I have a feeling you'll be hearing quite a bit more about that in the coming months. So I just wanted to make this group aware.
Thank you, Commissioner Taylor.
Question, Bishop Ranch, is that private property? So would this bill cover private property as well?
These shuttles could actually run on private property now without any legislation. If you wanted to buy one and run it all over your privately owned property, you could. But because Bishop Branch does have multiple buildings and you do have to cross a public street to get between the different buildings, that's why there is legislation needed.
Okay. Yes.
Commissioners, I just wanted to add something. I was going to add it at the end of the federal portion, but I just want to say this for our team is that when we started this 5 or 6 years ago, when I first got here, we engaged our federal delegation in Washington. We went back east, and I always say that we never really write legislation, but I would say that what wasn't mentioned in the federal program is in the FAST Act. There are two provisions that we had asked for over and over and over again for the last 5.5 years. One was a letter of no prejudice process, very similar to FTA. We sent Andrew Dorman at the Environment and Public Works Committee the language over and over, and that's embedded in the bill. And the other one, we used to say we want 100% eligible for technology for federal money. That provision's not there, but they have is it discretionary? It's a discretionary innovation track where we can actually go after money. And so we're looking at the innovation track to help offset the cost of a future potential hybrid-driven ferry boat rather than to use standard diesel. And so that engagement is paying dividends, I guess is the way to say that. And then we engage when asked, although I'm allergic to going back to Sacramento to testify in hearings, I still go if I have to. Why? Because I think we're doing some great things. You're supporting some great things here, and we need an allocation of dollars in the future to help support some of these things. And so this piece of legislation that we've and Lindsay has worked with Susan Bonilla, our Assemblymember Bonilla's office, this will allow us to prove that you can have a feeder service. We talked about that last night. How do we feed BART? Well, these are 25-mile-an-hour top speed, carry 12 people. You can't drive those on the road currently without having an operator, a steering wheel, and a brake pedal, but they're fully autonomous. And so we're going to test this new technology, and we need the legislation. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying we need to stay engaged in this process.
Thank you. And I sense there's strong concurrence by all the members of the authority. Maybe before you go, we have on our agenda item 8, which is recommendation to issue the request for a proposal for state legislative advocacy services. And I wondered if the commission or subcommittee would be willing to take that out of order while Mark is here. So, okay.
Okay, thank you, Commissioners. This is actually an item, as you know, Mr. Watts and his firm have been our state advocates for many years, and they've been doing a really wonderful job. But as we've been going back through and kind of looking at all of our agreements and updating our procedures and processes, we realized that it's been several years since we've actually put our state advocacy contract back out for competitive bid. So what we are planning to do with your approval is to continue to keep Mr. Watts and his firm on retainer as we go back out and competitively bid these services. We do have a fixed price that we're asking folks to bid on, but just in the interest of remaining transparent and open and fair, we think that it would be a good idea to be sure that we put this back out and allow other folks to potentially bid on these services and go through a competitive procurement for these services again. So that's what this item is.
Are there any questions, Commissioner Taylor?
Oh, question for you, Lindsay, in the sense of how long the contract? You've been, ever since I've been around, you've been around. Well, I don't mean that derogatory, but I want to clean that up there for you. And you've done a great job. So he's been around forever. So what I'm trying to say is how would.
So I believe the current letter agreement that Smith Watts and now Hartman are operating under was last updated in 2011. So it's been about 5 years or so. And generally, I think that I would prefer to have this go out every 3 or so years. So the terms of this contract will be a 2-year term with the option for this body to extend it for an additional year before we continue to competitively bid it.
Commissioner Butt?
This may be a fine point, but I'm not sure that putting it out to bid is the correct terminology. I think you're going to put out a request for proposals, but a bid indicates that it's price-based, and I see here the evaluation criteria for cost and price is only 10 points out of 100. So it's really a qualifications-based competition.
And I would agree. And my recollection is that typically for qualifications-based, the initial criteria don't include price. You choose the best qualified vendor, and then you negotiate price, which doesn't mean you can't say that the authority has a budget, just a minor modification. So you might talk with Mala about what the contracting rules are.
Okay.
All right. Commissioner Arnerich?
Yeah, so if with a 2-year contract, what would be the start date of this?
I believe I have to double check that we would try to do it on the new fiscal year for us, which would be July 1st.
Okay. Because the legislative years for the Assembly is a 2-year cycle, right? So that's, if we do that, we're going to be jumping over sort of odd terms. So somebody might work for us, but yet they can't follow up because it goes, so I would just give some consideration. It might be at least a 3-year, so you cover at least one full legislative cycle, and 2 years kind of short. So just as a consideration.
Commissioner Pierce?
I would just like to concur with Tom's point. I was going to ask that we change this to an RFQ, not an RFP. I think it really is a qualifications-based issue, and frankly, when we're setting the budget, we know that they're all going to use the whole budget. It's a matter of really who and how they manage the work that we're asking to be done, and qualifications are the exclusive part of this as far as I'm concerned.
Is there any, but first, is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, then is there a motion? Okay, so was that a motion to forward it to the authority with the amendments that have been discussed to make this an RFQ?
Yes, sir, with all
Right,
the
okay.
And consider it 3, I'd second it, consider it
Right,
3-year.
3-year term.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
very good. Is there a second to that motion? Second. All right. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Okay. So now, thank you. And will you get back to Sacramento in time for the? Okay. Yeah. Right. But you only go 25 miles an hour. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So that brings us to item 7, which is an authorization to execute amendment number 2 to our agreement 372 with WMH Corporation for environmental and final design services on I-680 State Route 4 interchange improvement project. Susan.
Good morning, Commissioner. Susan Miller, Director of Projects. First, I would like to note that you have a replacement handout for attachment B, which is the historical summary. We had a couple of formatting issues, and we also had one correction on a date. So we've done that. That's your handout in front of you. As you may recall, we've been working on the design for the I-680 SR4 Phase 3 project, which is one of the phases for reconstruction of the larger interchange at 684, which is 5 phases. This phase would widen Highway 4 in the median from about the vicinity of Morello Avenue in Martinez to 242 in Concord. It was originally envisioned as just that, a median widening project, which included the widening of various bridges in the project limits. However, as we progressed in the design, it became evident that the bridges at Grayson Creek could not be widened. They needed to be, those bridges entirely needed to be replaced. We've had some conversations on that in the past. Further, the new bridge is higher and requires elevation of the freeway in that vicinity, as well as relocation of a couple of large utilities. So this work to now replace the Grayson bridges has contributed to a shortfall in the project. These additional out-of-scope items, looking further and further designing the Grayson Creek bridge so we could put our arms around exactly what the problem was, looking at permitting issues and working with the utility relocations has contributed to why we need to do this amendment. There's also some additional out-of-scope items such as that have come up, such as seismic retrofit of the existing structures in the corridor that need to be widened that were not in the original agreement number 372. So this amendment will cover those out-of-scope items completed to date and work required to advance the design to 95%. A description of the precise work is summarized in the staff report and also included in detail in Attachment C. Concurrently, we're working on the utility relocations with the utility companies and acquiring the necessary right-of-way, and that's proceeding as approved by the authority last May in 2015. This is always a good idea to get these utilities relocated in advance because it takes a long time to acquire the right-of-way and work with those entities to move the utilities. So we're proceeding with that. Staff will continue to work on seeking additional funding for the project. As you may recall, we just moved about $5 million of STIP funds from another project over to this one recently. And in the spring, 95% will be complete. And then staff will return with recommendations on how to proceed with the project once we have a more refined cost and we assess where we're at on the funding. At that point in time, another amendment to this contract will be necessary to extend the contract term and cover additional work depending on the direction that we select on how to proceed. So to conclude, staff requests authorization for the chair to execute Amendment Number 2 to Agreement Number 372 with WMH in the amount of $1,445,066 for a new total agreement value of $7,415,030. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. And I also have Tim Lee in the audience with WMH. He's the project manager of the project.
Commissioner Pearson and Commissioner Arnott.
Thank you, Susan. I think it's really imperative that we go to the 95% design stage with this complicated project. These are things that we've been working on for so long, and not being almost 100% ready when any money might become available would be a fatal flaw. And so I think it's absolutely imperative that we get this done. It's more efficient to build the entire section at once if we possibly can accumulate the dollars. So I think it's just really critical that we go forward with this. Thank you.
Actually, I agree with everything Julie just said. But my question is, I read it this way. I just want to know out loud. It appears that, when you see this much change in a contract, it's driven by a variety of reasons. And I just want to hear it from you straightforward, that this is all driven by scope change that we've requested.
Correct.
There's no miscues in this. This is really scope driven based on the initial studies that have developed a different direction of the project and replacing things, et cetera, so that if we knew that all ahead of time, we'd still be in the same place, is my point.
That's correct.
Okay, great. And then I'd make a motion to accept the report and the amendment. Oh, second. Sorry.
Commissioner Arnott, second by Commissioner Arnott. Is there any public comment? Seeing none, any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. It's unanimous. Thank you. So that then brings us to various reports, and I have nothing to report as chair. Are there any commissioner comments and reports? Executive staff reports? And there's no other business, so we are adjourned until February 4th at 8:30. Thank you.